Wow! And it is all over!
Former UFC lightweight and part-time welterweight Sage Northcutt. You guys may have heard of him. He just made his one championship debut over the weekend, and to say it did not go as planned and did not go well would be an understatement. If you didn't see the fight, you haven't heard about it. Sage Northcutt got viciously knocked out in, it was under 30 seconds. I think it was like 29 seconds, something like that. He fought a guy by the name of Cosmo Alexander, who, if you aren't familiar with him, Cosmo is, or does, I should say, have a pretty extensive Muay Thai background. So he's a great striker himself. He fought in quite a few times in Lion Fights, I believe, which is a Muay Thai organization. So he has a very extensive striking background. He's a great striker. In my opinion, it was a terrible matchup. Easy to say in retrospect, easy to say in hindsight, but thought the same before the fight. In my opinion, it was a terrible introduction to one championship for Sage. It was a horrible matchup. If they're trying to build Sage up and make him into a star, why would you book him against a Cosmo Alexander, a dude who has a ton of power? He's an incredible striker, and Sage's one downfall, or his biggest weakness, in my opinion, in the UFC, probably his grappling defense. But his second biggest weakness was definitely his striking defense. He's a good striker himself, but he comes from a point fighting karate background. So he's not by any means known for his knockout power. He's got a good variety of strikes, but he also, because of his background, at least that's what I attribute a lot of it to, he does not have very good striking defense. Because when you're used to, when you come from a background of point fighting karate, obviously the penalty for having bad striking defense isn't nearly as severe as if you come from like a Muay Thai background or a kickboxing background. In point fighting and karate, you're just going to get touched up. Someone's going to score points on you if they're hitting you. They're usually not going to be hitting you with KO shots. Whereas in Muay Thai, you're a lot more likely to get KO'd from some of these shots. So because of that, that's why I don't think Sage ever developed great striking defense. But anyways, like I said, his two biggest weaknesses: submission defense. That's how he lost. I think he was 6-2 in the UFC. Both of his losses were via submission, and he looked very vulnerable on the ground. On the flip side of that, he's always been a very explosive dude. He's very athletic, very explosive. He has a good blast double. So I thought his best route to victory in his one championship debut versus Cosmo would have been to get the takedown, because like I said, Cosmo comes from a striking background, a Muay Thai background. Don't think the dude's known for his wrestling defense or his takedown defense. I don't think he's known for any incredible grappling either. So Sage's best route to victory, probably the blast double, take him to the ground, hit him with some ground and pound, maybe even get a submission, who knows. Unfortunately for Sage, he didn't have anywhere near the time to even develop or implement a game plan, because like I said, the fight only lasted 20-something seconds. He was hit with a hard shot. I think Sage was, when he got KO'd, I think he got hit with like an overhand right, and he was in the process of throwing like a jab, so he got countered with an overhand right or a hook. I didn't watch the fight live. I just saw a quick recap of it on Twitter, which it only lasted a couple seconds, so I pretty much saw the whole fight. But it wasn't pretty. It was a rough knockout, and I also just saw Sage put up a post on Instagram saying he just got out of a 9-hour surgery, and he had like 8 facial fractures or something. That is a rough welcoming to a new organization. Going all the way to one championship, having your debut fight against a good striker, and then you get knocked down 20-something seconds, and you get hit so hard that you break your face in 8 or 9 different places, and you have to undergo a 9-hour surgery. That's tough, man. Fighters have a rough job. Anyways, the whole point of this video is not to make you guys feel sorry for Sage. He knows what he signed up for. I'm not trying to throw a pity party for him, but I do want to say this and ask you guys what your thoughts are. Sage is not the only one that had a rough introduction to one championship. They had 3 recent huge signings of former UFC fighters. The biggest obviously being Demetrious Mighty Mouse Johnson, the second biggest being Eddie Alvarez, and then the third biggest being Sage Northcutt. They've all already made their debuts, and all of them had a rough go at it. Mighty Mouse won, but he was challenged more so than he had been challenged in the last, aside from the Henry Cejudo fight, the second fight. He was challenged in that first round more than he's been challenged in any recent fights that I can recall in the UFC. He had quite a few rough moments in the first round, and even in the second round, the other dude was he was bringing it up until, you know, Mighty Mouse eventually ended up finishing him. And I don't know if you guys saw the Eddie Alvarez fight, but Eddie Alvarez didn't have a much better go at it than Sage Northcutt. He lasted longer, but he pretty much got destroyed the whole fight, and then he got finished too. I think it was in the second round, and his eye pretty much exploded when he got finished. So I'm sure I would imagine he had to have surgery of some type to get his eye fixed. Definitely didn't have as rough as a go as Sage Northcutt. I'm sure it wasn't a 9-hour surgery, and I don't think he had any orbital fractures or any facial fractures. So it wasn't quite as rough as Sage Northcutt, but it was still a pretty rough introduction. And I don't think too many MMA fans expected Eddie Alvarez to lose. I think the majority probably don't really know who Cosmo Alexander is, and therefore they probably expected Sage Northcutt to win as well. As I mentioned, I didn't like his chances from the get-go. I thought it was a really bad matchup for him, unless he, you know, employed his wrestling game, which I thought he would have, but like I said, he didn't really have enough time to implement any game plan. So my question to you guys is, does this prove that the UFC isn't quite as far above other organizations as many MMA fans believe? Are their fighters a lot more evenly ranked to other organizations, or is this just a coincidence that two of the UFC's best, I would say Eddie Alvarez was definitely one of the best at 155 in the UFC, and obviously Mighty Mouse ruled the 125-pound division for a long time. Broke all kinds of records. In my opinion, he won that second Henry Cejudo fight, so he's definitely the best 125-pounder of all time, in my opinion. And he had a tough fight and won championship. Eddie Alvarez got destroyed. Sage Northcutt got destroyed. So what do you guys think? Is the UFC overrated? Are their fighters overrated? Or does that just prove that there's some really talented fighters in some of these other organizations, like One Championship, or Bellator, or Rizin, or, you know, whatever organization it may be? Maybe the UFC doesn't have all the top guys. That's my opinion. That's my thoughts. I wouldn't necessarily say that this proves that the UFC fighters are overrated. And honestly, it could be a case of like the crossover organization jitters. A lot of guys, when they first come over to the UFC, you hear about the octagon jitters, and a lot of times their first fight doesn't quite go as planned. For instance, Eddie Alvarez's first fight in the UFC was a loss, although it was to Donald Cowboy Cerrone, so you can't really fault him for that. Honestly, in my opinion, if they fought again, if they had a rematch, I think Cowboy would beat him again. So I don't necessarily know if that proves too much, but it does prove that sometimes there is these jitters when you go to a new organization. Maybe that was the case, I don't know. Eddie Alvarez looked completely lost in this fight. I thought he was getting dominated the whole time. Sage Northcutt, it was tough to say. The fight really didn't go long enough to prove anything other than, you know, he got caught and he got hit with a really hard punch. So, my opinion, we're going to have to wait and see how these guys' next few fights play out. I want to say all three of them signed like 3-fight contracts, so they all got their first fight out of the way. Only one of them won the fight, so let's see how the next 2 fights play out. Maybe they'll both win, maybe they'll go on to be dominant champions in one championship. But in my opinion, this just proves that the UFC is not quite as far ahead of some of these other organizations as a lot of MMA fans believe. I think it proves that there's a lot of talent out there that the UFC doesn't have, and there's a lot of these unknown guys to most casual MMA fans throughout the world that are very talented, and they just aren't as well known by many fans in the US because they're in some of these organizations overseas. Either way, I think it's a good thing for MMA in general, for all these different organizations to have these talented guys. It makes it more fun, in my opinion, as an MMA fan, because then we have a lot more fight cards to look forward to. And it proves that some of these dudes in these other organizations are really talented, and it gives us as MMA fans a reason to watch some of these other organizations. Whereas before, if Eddie Alvarez went over there, Sage Northcutt went over there, and, you know, I expected Mighty Mouse to dominate when he went over there. But if Eddie Alvarez and Sage Northcutt go over there and they completely dominate and obliterate everyone in one championship, people are just going to be like, oh, they're just fighting cans. You know, one championship, all the fighters are cans, they're garbage, they probably wouldn't get as many viewers. Now, I'll be tuning into a lot more one championship fights because I think this proves that there's a lot of talent there. So in my opinion, it's a good thing. I feel bad for Sage Northcutt. He seems like a really, really good kid, really extremely nice guy. So I hope he recovers. I wish him well. But I personally look forward to watching the next one championship card. If nothing else, this just proves that there is a lot of talent out there that is not in the UFC. So I know I'll be tuning in to one championship from here on out, and I'm sure a lot of you watching will as well. Let me know what you guys think down below. Do you think this proves that UFC fighters are overrated? Do you think this proves that UFC is overrated as an organization and they don't have the majority of the top fighters in the world? Or does it just prove that there's a ton of other talent out there that a lot of casual mixed martial arts fans in the US and perhaps other places in the world just don't know about? And now this is helping introduce them on a bigger stage. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.
My goodness!
Oh my God!
Just like that!
That is some serious power!
Wow!